John Turner. I'm the general manager of the Intercontinental Hotel, and I am reading chapter 23 from the John Steinbeck great Cannery Row. A black gloom settled over the palace flophouse. All the joy went out of it. Mac came back to the laboratory with his mouth torn and his teeth broken. As a kind of penance, he did not wash his face. He went to his bed and pulled his blanket over his head, and he didn't get up all day. His heart was as bruised as his mouth. He went over all the bad things he'd done in his life and everything he'd ever done bad. He was very sad. Huey and Jones sat for a while staring into space, and then morosely they went over to the Hedondino cannery and applied for jobs and got them. Hazel felt so bad that he walked to Monterey and picked a fight with a soldier and lost it on purpose. That made him feel a little better to be utterly beaten by a man Hazel could have licked without half trying. Darling was the only one of the whole club. She spent the day under Mac's bed, happily eating up his shoes. She was a clever dog and her teeth were very sharp. Twice in his black despair, Mac reached under the bed and caught her and put her in bed with him for company. But she squirmed out and went back to eating his shoes. Eddie moved on down to La Ida and talked to his friend, the bartender. He got a few drinks and borrowed some nickels with which he played Melancholy Baby 5 times on the jukebox. Mac and the boys were under a cloud and they knew it, and they knew they deserved it. They had become social outcasts. All of their good intentions were forgotten now. The fact that the party was given for Doc, if it was known, was never mentioned or taken into consideration. The story ran through the Bear Flag. It was told in the canneries. At La Ida, drunks discussed it virtuously. Lee Chong refused to comment. He was feeling financially bruised. And the story as it grew went this way. They had stolen liquor and money. They had maliciously broken into the laboratory and systematically destroyed it out of pure malice and evil. People who really knew better took this view. Some of the drunks at La Ida considered going over and beating the hell out of the whole lot of them to show them they couldn't do a thing like that to Doc. Only a sense of the solidarity and fighting ability of Mac and the boys saved them from some kind of reprisal. There were people who felt virtuous about the affair, who hadn't had the material of virtue for a long time. The fiercest of the whole lot was Tom Shelligan, who would have been at the party if he'd known about it. Socially, Mac and the boys were beyond the pale. Sam Malloy didn't speak to them as they went by the boiler. They drew into themselves and no one could foresee how they would come out of the cloud. For there are 2 possible reactions to social ostracism. Either a man emerges determined to be better, purer, or kindlier, or he goes bad, challenges the world, and does even worse things. This last is by far the commonest reaction to stigma. Mac and the boys balanced on the scales of good and evil. They were kind and sweet to Darling. They were forbearing and patient with one another. When the first reaction was over, they gave the palace flophouse a cleaning such as it had never had. They polished the bright work on the stove, and they washed all their clothes and blankets. Financially, they had become dull and solvent. Huey and Jones were working and bringing home their pay. They bought groceries up the hill at the thrift market because they could not stand the reproving eyes of Lee Chong. It was during this time that Doc made an observation, which may have been true, but since there was one factor missing in his reasoning, it is not known whether he was correct. It was the 4th of July. Doc was sitting in the laboratory with Richard Frost. They drank beer and listened to a new album of Scarlatti and looked out the window. In front of the palace flophouse there was a large log of wood where Mac and the boys were sitting in the mid-morning sun. They faced down the hill towards the laboratory. Doc said, "Look at them. There are your true philosophers, I think," he went on. "That Mac and the boys know everything that's ever happened in the world and possibly everything that will happen. I think they survive in this particular world better than other people. In a time when people tear themselves to pieces with ambition and nervousness and covetousness, they are relaxed. All of our so-called successful men are sick men with bad stomachs and bad souls. But Mac and the boys are healthy and curiously clean. They can do what they want. They can satisfy their appetites without calling them something else." This speech so dried out Doc's throat that he drained his beer glass. He waved 2 fingers in the air and smiled. "There's nothing like that first taste of beer," he said. Richard Foss said, "I think they're all just like anyone else. They just haven't got any money." "They could get it," Doc said. "They could ruin their lives and get money. Mac has qualities of genius. They're all very clever if they want something. They just know the nature of things too well to be caught in that wanting." If Doc had known of the sadness of Mac and the boys, he would not have made the next statement. But no one had told him about the social pressure that was exerted against the inmates of the palace. He poured beer slowly into his glass. "I think I can show you proof," he said. "You see how they were sitting facing this way? Well, in about half an hour, the 4th of July parade is going to pass on Lighthouse Avenue. By just turning their heads, they can see it. By standing up, they can watch it. And by walking 2 short blocks, they can be right beside it. Now, I will bet you a quart of beer they won't even turn their heads." "Suppose they don't," said Richard Frost. "What will that prove?" "What will it prove?" cried Doc. "Why, just that they know what will be in the parade. They will know that the mayor will ride first in the automobile with bunting streaming back from the hood. Next will come Long Bob on his white horse with the flag. Then the city council. Then 2 companies of soldiers from the Presidio. Next the Elks with purple umbrellas. Then the Knights Templar in white ostrich feathers and carrying swords. Next the Knights of Columbus with red ostrich feathers and carrying swords. Mac and the boys know that. The band will play. They've seen it all. They don't have to look again." "The man doesn't live who doesn't have to look at a parade," said Richard Frost. "It's a bet, then. It's a bet." "It has always seemed strange to me," said Doc. "The things we admire in men, kindness and generosity, openness, honesty, understanding, and feeling, are the concomitants of failure in our system. And those traits we detest, sharpness, greed, acquisitiveness, meanness, egotism, and self-interest, are the traits of success. And while men admire the quality of the first, they love the produce of the second. Who wants to be good if he has to be hungry too?" said Richard Frost. "Oh, it isn't just a matter of hunger. It's something quite different. The sale of souls to gain the whole world is completely voluntary and almost unanimous, but not quite. Everywhere in the world there are Mac and the boys. I've seen them in an ice cream cellar in Mexico and in an alute in Alaska. You know how they tried to give me a party and something went wrong? But they wanted to give me a party. That was their impulse. Listen," said Doc, "isn't that the band I hear?" Quickly, he filled 2 glasses with beer, and the 2 of them stepped close to the window. Mac and the boys sat dejectedly on their log and faced the laboratory. The sound of the band came from Lighthouse Avenue, the drums echoing back from the buildings. And suddenly the mayor's car crossed, and it sprayed bunting from the radiator. Then Long Bob on his white horse carrying the flag. Then the band, then the soldiers, the Elks, the Knights Templar, the Knights of Columbus. Richard and Doc leaned forward tensely, but they were watching the line of men sitting on the log. And not a head turned, not a neck straightened up. The parade filed past, and they did not move. And the parade was gone. Doc drained his glass and waved 2 fingers gently in the air. He said, "Ha, there's nothing in the world like the first taste of beer." Richard started for the door. "What kind of beer do you want?" "The same kind," said Doc gently. He was smiling up the hill at Mac and the boys. "It's all fine to say time will heal everything. This too shall pass away. People will forget. And things like that when you were not involved. But when you were there, it is no passage of time. People do not forget. And you were in the middle of something that does not change." Doc didn't know the pain and self-destructive criticism in the Palace Flophouse, or he might have tried to do something about it. And Mac and the boys did not know he felt, or they would never have held up their heads again. It was a bad time. Evil stalked darkly in the vacant lot. Sam Malloy had a number of fights with his wife, and she cried all the time. The echoes inside the boiler made it sound as though she were crying underwater. Mac and the boys seemed to be the node of trouble. The nice bouncer at the Bear Flag threw at a drunk, but threw him so hard and too far and broke his back. Alfred had to go over to Salinas 3 times before it was cleared up, and that didn't make Alfred feel very well. Ordinarily, he was too good a bouncer to hurt anyone. His A&C was a miracle of rhythm and grace. On top of that, a group of high-minded ladies in the town demanded that dens of vice must close to protect young American manhood. This happened about once a year in the dead period between 4th of July and the county fair. Dora usually closed the bear flag for a week when it happened. It wasn't so bad. Everyone got a vacation and little repairs to the plumbing and the walls could be made. But this year the ladies went on a real crusade. They wanted somebody's scalp. It had been a dull summer and they were restless. It got so bad that they had to be told who actually owned the property where vice was practiced, what the rents were, and what little hardships might be the result of their closing. That was how close they were to being a serious menace. Dora was closed a full 2 weeks, and there were 3 conventions in Monterey where the bear flag was closed. Word got around and Monterey lost 5 conventions for the following year. Things were bad all over. Doc had to get a loan at the bank to pay for the glass that was broken at the party. Elmer Riccati went to sleep on the Southern Pacific track and lost both of his legs. A sudden and completely unexpected storm tore a purse seiner and 3 Lampera boats loose from their moorings and tossed them broken and sad on Del Monte Beach. There is no explaining a series of misfortunes like that. Every man blames himself. People in their black minds remember sins committed secretly and wonder whether they have caused the evil sequence. One man may put it down to sunspots while another, invoking the law of probabilities, doesn't believe it. Not even the doctors had a good time of it. For while many people were sick, none of it was good paying sickness. It was nothing a good physic or a patent medicine couldn't take care of. Wakefield caught a sculpin with 2 heads and sold it to the museum for $8. The wall of evil of waiting was broken. It broke away in chunks. The curtains were drawn at the laboratory that night, and Gregorian music played until 2 o'clock. Then the music stopped and no one came out. Some force wrought with Lee Chong's heart, and all in an oriental moment he forgave Mac and the boys and wrote off the frog debt, which had been a monetary headache from the beginning. And to prove to the boys that he'd forgiven them, he took a pint of old tennis shoes up and presented to them. Their trading at the thrift market had hurt his feelings, but it was all over now. Lee's visit coincided with the first destructive, healthy impulse Darling had since her illness. She was completely spoiled now, and no one thought of housebreaking her. When Lee Chong came in with his gift, Darling was deliberately and happily destroying Hazel's only pair of rubber boots, while her happy masters applauded her. Mac never visited the bear flag professionally. It would have seemed a little like incest to him. There was a house up by the baseball park that he patronized. Thus, he went into the front bar. Everyone thought he wanted a beer. He stepped up to Alfred. Dora around, he asked. What do you want with her, Alfred asked. I got something I want to ask her. What about? That's none of your goddamn business, said Mac. Okay, have it your way. I'll see if she wants to talk to you. A moment later, he led Mac into the sanctum. Dora sat at a roll-top desk. Her orange hair was piled in ringlets on her head, and she wore a green eye shade. With a stub pen, she was bringing her books up to date, a final double-entry ledger. She was dressed in a magnificent pink silk wrapper with lace at the wrists and throat. When Mac came in, she whirled her pivot chair about and faced him. Alfred stood in the door and waited. Mac stood until Alfred closed the door and left. Dora scrutinized him suspiciously. Well, what can I do for you, she demanded. You see, ma'am, said Mac. Well, I guess you heard what we done over at Doc some time back. Dora pushed the eye shade back up on her head, and she put the pen in an old-fashioned coil spring holder. Yeah, she said, I heard. Well, ma'am, we did it for Doc. You may not believe it, but we wanted to give him a party. Only he didn't get home in time, and, well, she got out of hand. So I heard, said Dora. Well, what do you want me to do? Well, said Mac, I and the boys thought we would ask you. You know what we think of Doc. We want to ask you what you thought we could do for him that would kind of show him. Dora said, and she flopped back in her pivot chair and crossed her legs, smoothed her wrapper over her knees. She shook out a cigarette, lighted it, and studied. You gave him a party he didn't get to. Why don't you give him a party he does get to? Jesus, said Mac afterwards talking to the boys, it was just as simple as that. Now there's one hell of a woman. No wonder she got to be a madam. There's one hell of a woman.